I've been a waitress in New York City long enough to know when a customer's going to be a problem. The signs are always there. The quick glance up and down like they're sizing you up, the sharp tone, the way they act like asking for a refill is some kind of royal decree. Margaret was one of those customers. She waltzed into the diner on a Tuesday morning, heels clicking against the tile, her designer bag perched perfectly on her arm. I could tell right away she wasn't the type who usually ate in places like this. Too many choices on the menu. Too many people who weren't paid to smile at her. I walked up to her booth, notepad in hand. "Good morning. What can I get you?" She barely looked at me. "Coffee. Black. And a fruit bowl. No bananas." "Got it. Anything else?" She let out this tiny, impatient sigh, like I'd already wasted too much of her time. "Just make sure the fruit is fresh." I nodded and turned to go, but before I could take a step, she added, "And don't take too long." I've dealt with worse. Rude customers are part of the job, but something about her tone rubbed me the wrong way. Like she thought she was better than me just because she could afford a handbag that probably cost more than my rent. I brought her order out as fast as I could. She took one sip of her coffee and wrinkled her nose. "This is cold." It wasn't. I had poured it straight from the pot, but I knew better than to argue. "I'll get you a fresh one." I turned to leave, but then she said it, loud enough for the table next to her to hear. Jesus, do they even hire people who speak English properly anymore? It hit like a slap. My English wasn't perfect. Sure, but I spoke it well enough. Well enough to work, to pay my bills, to live my life in a country that wasn't always kind to people like me. I swallowed the anger rising in my throat. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her off. Let her know she wasn't as important as she thought she was. But I didn't. Because people like her don't listen to people like me. So I just turned away, my hands gripping the coffee pot a little too tight. I poured her another cup, steaming hot, and set it down without a word. She didn't thank me. She never even looked at me. Just another rich woman in a city full of them, convinced the world revolved around her. I walked away, pretending her words didn't matter. But they did. By the time Margaret left, I'd shaken it off. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The thing is, when you work a job like mine, you can't afford to carry every insult with you. If I let every rude customer get under my skin, I'd never make it through a shift. So I did what I always do. I kept moving, kept smiling, kept working. But later that night, as I sat on the subway heading home, I caught myself replaying it. The way she'd said it, like I wasn't even a person, like I was just background noise in her perfect little world. I shook my head and turned my focus to the window, watching the city blur past. New York has a way of making you feel small if you let it. There's always someone richer, someone louder, someone more important. People like Margaret, they don't see people like me because they don't have to. The train screeched into my stop, and I made my way up to the street. The night air was thick with city smells, hot garbage, car exhaust, something fried from a food cart down the block. Home was a 6-story walk-up in a building that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years, but it was mine. I paid my rent. I worked hard. That was enough. The next morning, I was back at the diner. Another shift. Another string of customers who barely looked up from their phones. And then, just before noon, Margaret walked in again. I felt my whole body tense. Not her again. She looked just as polished as the day before. Black blazer, pearl earrings, phone in hand like it was an extension of her arm. She didn't recognize me. Not surprising. People like her don't remember the people they insult. She slid into a booth and barely glanced up when I approached. Coffee. Black. I kept my voice steady. Coming right up. I brought it over, placed it in front of her, and turned to leave. But before I could, she spoke. "Wait, this doesn't have oat milk." I blinked. "You ordered it black." She frowned like I'd just insulted her. I said I wanted oat milk. I knew for a fact she hadn't, but arguing would only make things worse. "I'll get you some." I walked away, biting my tongue so hard it hurt. When I came back with the oat milk, she was too busy scrolling through her phone to acknowledge me. I set it down and walked off without a word. I should have been used to it. This city is full of people like her. People who don't see you, don't care, don't think about what it's like to be on the other side of their privilege. But something about her still got to me. And I had no idea that, by the end of the day, everything would change. The afternoon rush had just started when Margaret left. Good. I was sick of seeing her face. I spent the next few hours the way I always did, on my feet, balancing trays, forcing a smile even when my back ached. The usual mix of customers came and went: construction workers on their lunch break, office guys with their ties loosened, tired parents trying to keep their kids from knocking over the syrup bottles. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. I grabbed my bag from the back, clocked out, and stepped onto the street. The sky was already dark, the sidewalks crowded with people moving like they had somewhere better to be. I blended right in, just another person trying to get home, just another pair of footsteps lost in the city noise. I was halfway down the block when I heard it, a scream. Not just any scream, the kind that makes your heart stop for a second. The kind that tells you something is really, really wrong. I turned toward the sound and saw her. Margaret. She was near the curb, one high heel twisted at an awkward angle, her expensive bag spilled across the pavement. Her phone was a few feet away, shattered. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the man standing over her. He looked desperate, wild-eyed. His hoodie was pulled up, his hands clenched into fists. "Give me the bag," he snarled. Margaret was frozen. She clutched her wrist like it hurt, her face pale with shock. People were walking by, watching, but no one stopped. Typical New York. I could have kept walking too. Could have ignored it, gone home, let her deal with it. Would have been easy, after the way she treated me. But I didn't. Before I could think twice, I stepped forward. "Hey!" My voice came out sharper than I expected. "Leave her alone." The guy turned to me, eyes narrowing. "Mind your business." Margaret looked at me like she couldn't believe I existed, like I was some glitch in her version of the world. I took another step closer. "Just walk away, man. It's not worth it." For a second, I thought he might actually do it. Then he lunged. It happened fast, too fast for me to react. He grabbed Margaret's bag and yanked hard, sending her stumbling back onto the pavement with a cry. Then he bolted, disappearing into the crowd before I could even move. Margaret just sat there, her hand shaking. And suddenly, she wasn't some rich woman who thought she was better than me. She was just scared. I sighed and held out a hand. She hesitated, but then, slowly she took it. Margaret's hand was ice cold in mine. Unsteady. I pulled her up, and she winced, grabbing her wrist. Probably sprained. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven. For the first time since I met her, she looked human. Not polished, not untouchable, just shaken. I glanced around. The city hadn't stopped for her. People kept walking. A few had slowed down to watch the scene unfold, but now that the show was over, they moved on. That's how it is here. New York doesn't pick sides. It just keeps moving. Margaret swallowed hard, looking down at her torn stocking, her scuffed designer heels. Then her eyes flicked up to me. You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I shrugged. "Yeah, well, you needed help." She pressed her lips together, like she didn't know what to do with that answer. I bent down, picking up her things. Her wallet, a lipstick tube, a crushed pack of gum. I handed them to her one by one. She took them without a word. Her phone was wrecked. Spiderweb cracks covered the screen. When I held it out, she just stared at it like it wasn't even hers. She shook her head. "I don't know what to do." I sighed. "You need ice for that wrist. Maybe a hospital." She blinked at me. No, I just need to get home." I exhaled, glancing around. "You taking a cab?" She shifted, trying to straighten her jacket like it would somehow fix the mess of what just happened. I was going to call a car, but she looked down at her phone again, her expression tight. Yeah, that wasn't happening. I looked around at the street. "You got cash?" She gave me a blank stare, like I just asked if she had a spare spaceship. Of course she didn't. People like her didn't carry cash. They had apps, cards, drivers waiting at the curb. But right now, none of that was working for her. And I could have left her there. Could have walked away, let her figure it out herself. But instead, I sighed and pulled a few crumpled bills from my pocket. "Come on," I said, flagging down a cab. Margaret hesitated. She glanced at me, then at the money in my hand, like it physically hurt her to accept it. But she did. She climbed into the cab without another word. And right before the door shut, she looked at me. Really looked at me. Like, for the first time, she actually saw me. The cab pulled away, blending into the endless stream of traffic, but for a moment, Margaret's eyes stayed locked on mine through the window. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe, passed across her face before she disappeared into the city. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. That was that. I turned back toward the subway, shaking off the whole thing. Margaret wasn't my problem anymore. She'd get home, prop her swollen wrist on a silk pillow, and by tomorrow, she'd go right back to treating people like me as invisible. I knew how this worked. I made it home late, tossing my bag onto the tiny kitchen counter before collapsing onto the couch. My feet ached, my head pounded, and all I wanted was sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead, my mind kept circling back to the look on her face. That moment in the cab, the way she'd taken the money from my hand like it was something foreign, something that had never been offered to her like that before. Maybe it hadn't. The next day at the diner started like any other. The same clatter of dishes, the same hum of conversations blending into each other. I slipped back into routine like nothing had happened. Then, right before the lunch rush, the door swung open. Margaret! I almost dropped the coffee pot. She stepped inside hesitantly, looking different. Not in the way she dressed. She still had that expensive air about her, but in the way she carried herself. Less rigid, less like she owned the place. She scanned the room until her eyes landed on me. I braced myself. She walked up to the counter, standing awkwardly before clearing her throat. Hi! It was the first time she'd ever greeted me. I wiped my hands on my apron. Hey! For a second, she didn't say anything. She just stood there. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the counter. I frowned. What's that? She hesitated, then pushed it toward me. It's some for the cab, and for your kindness. I raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to. I did. She swallowed, glancing down like she wasn't sure how to say what came next. I was awful to you. Before. And she sighed, shaking her head. I don't have an excuse. I stared at her, waiting for the usual. Some half-hearted explanation. Some excuse about stress or a bad day. But none came. Just honesty. Margaret exhaled. No one else stopped. Her voice was quieter now. You didn't have to help me, especially after how I treated you. But you did. Something in my chest tightened. I glanced down at the envelope. I didn't want her money. Not really. But something about the gesture, the fact that she even showed up, made me pause. I tapped the counter lightly. Want some coffee? Her lips parted slightly, like she wasn't expecting that. Then, for the first time, Margaret smiled. Yeah, she said softly. I'd like that. I poured the coffee, setting the cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Not drinking, just holding it like it was something solid to hold on to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The diner buzzed around us, plates clinking, the low murmur of conversation, the sizzle of something on the griddle. But at the counter, it felt like we were in our own quiet space, separate from the noise. Margaret glanced down at her wrist, wrapped in a fresh bandage. Doctor said it's just a bad sprain. I nodded. That's good. She traced the rim of her cup, then let out a small breath. I haven't stopped thinking about yesterday. I stayed quiet. She shook her head, looking almost embarrassed. I've spent my whole life moving through the world like everything was built around me. Like people existed to serve, not to be seen. Her fingers tightened around the mug. And then, the second I needed help, none of those people I thought were like me even looked my way. I watched her, waiting. She swallowed hard, like admitting it out loud tasted bitter. But you did. I shrugged. Someone had to. She let out a small, humorless laugh. And I didn't deserve it. I leaned on the counter, looking her in the eye. Doesn't work like that. Margaret held my gaze, something unreadable in her expression. Then she nodded, slowly. For the first time, I saw her for what she really was, just another person trying to figure things out. She pulled the envelope closer. Will you at least take this? Not just for the cab, but because I want to do something right. I hesitated, then took it. Not because I needed the money, but because I could tell she needed me to take it. To make it real. Margaret let out a breath, like she'd been holding it. She lifted her cup, took a sip and smiled. "This is good coffee," she said. I smirked. "Told you it wasn't cold." She actually laughed. A real one this time. And just like that, the space between us shifted. Not erased, not forgotten, but changed. And in a city that never stops, that was something. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.